Welcome to the third lecture of the 25th Annual Lefeber Winter Series on Aging. And I'm your host, Elena Volpi. This lecture series features nationally and internationally renowned speakers who focus on topics relevant to aging and geriatrics. The series honors the memory of Dr. Edward Lefeber. He was a UTMB professor of medicine and was a strong proponent of elder care and the study of aging at a time where very few doctors were prepared to care for older patients. Right before he died, UTMB established the Division of Geriatrics, which is carrying on his medical legacy. And after his death, family and friends endowed this lecture series in the City Center on Aging to honor his memory. Today, I'm really happy to introduce the speaker of the day, Dr. Jennifer Manley. Dr. Manley is a professor in the Cognitive Neuroscience Division of the Taub Institute for Research on Alzheimer's Disease and the Aging Brain, the Sergeyevsky Center, and the Department of Neurology at Columbia University Medical Center in New York. Dr. Manley is also a practicing neuropsychologist in New York Presbyterian Hospital. She has a double major bachelor's degree in psychology and integrative biology from the University of California at Berkeley. And then she has also a clinical psychology, she has a doctorate degree in clinical psychology from the University of California in San Diego. And she did a clinical psychology internship at Brown University, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship in neuropsychology at Columbia University in New York, where she was later hired as a junior faculty member and has climbed the entire academic career ladder up to a position she holds today as a full professor. Her research focuses on racial disparities in Alzheimer's disease and related dementias and is very well funded with 3 large NIH grants, of which she is the principal investigator, and also another, I think 14 other NIH grants in which she is a co-investigator. Not sure how she can do that, but she's doing it. So she has published more than 190 papers in peer-reviewed journals and 10 book chapters, and she's been serving in several NIH study sections for many years, and is a member of a number of national and international scientific advisory panels, including the National Medical and Scientific Advisory Board of the Alzheimer's Association and the Committee on Population of the National Academy of Sciences. She has received several honors and awards, among which the Tony Wong Diversity Award for Outstanding Mentorship of the National Academy of Neuropsychology. And today she will talk about the Lifecourse mechanism of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia disparities. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Manley.
Thank you. It's very much an honor to be here and to be presenting at this wonderful series in honor of healthy older adults. And I first want to start by thanking the people that I work with. I work with a large group of people. Myself and my close collaborator, Adam Rickman, at Columbia University have, in a lot of ways, combined our research team to form a massive group of people who are looking at diverse groups of older adults, mainly in northern Manhattan. So I'll give you the basic bottom line of my talk right from the beginning, which is that social forces are fundamental causes of disparities in brain health and in dementia. And I'll show you now some examples of that. I'll start with just showing you that there are some disparities in dementia and brain health. But what I mean by fundamental causes is that if you intervene on the mediator, so for example, you provide dyads of caregiver and person with dementia with a more comprehensive care for the person with dementia, or relief of burden for the caregiver, that's good. But you haven't intervened yet on the fundamental cause of a disparity in access to health care, or in preparation for what will clearly be a very stressful circumstance when a close loved one has dementia. So fundamental social forces include race, sex, gender, and ethnicity, language, sexual orientation. So all of these are sources of bias, and they're sources of discrimination, and we can accumulate this stress and sources of poor health care and disease risk factors throughout our life. So they're reproduced through multiple mechanisms. Many of you have experienced this kind of fundamental social forces when, for example, a school district decides, we're not going to put up with this resegregation of our schools. We're going to integrate the schools again so that children of all backgrounds will go to elementary or middle school together. And then suddenly the rich white people move out of the neighborhood to get away from those schools, or they decide to let's put a gifted program in. And so there's always this fundamental cause that keeps replicating itself no matter what you do to the mediators. And these fundamental social causes have implications on many aspects of Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. I'm going to be talking mainly about this area, which is sort of the mechanisms of why some people are more resilient to the disease, and why some communities are able to avoid dementia more than others. But it also has a major impact on diagnosis and recognition. So in some communities, dementia is very much stigmatized. That can work against diagnosis. At the same time, in other communities, dementia is under-recognized, that maybe it's more, seen as normal aging, but that actually works against diagnosis as well, because people don't come to the doctor. It's sort of part of normal aging. As a neuropsychologist, in terms of diagnosis, I'm really interested in whether our instruments have the proper validity across different ethnic and racial and language groups. So this is another way that what we're exposed to in our life can impact the dementia experience. And then obviously I've been talking to a lot of people today about once a person has cognitive impairment, the social environment has a major impact on the experience of care and delivery of care, and whether that is a fair delivery or not. So there are tons of different social factors that we can talk about. I'm going to focus a lot on school quality as an early life social factor. I will also talk about racism and discrimination as impacting brain health later in life. But there is a great deal of work right now occurring in a number of places around the country, people looking at immigration and acculturative stress and how that may relate to later life cognitive function. I'll describe some studies that we can leverage to look at geographic region and regional risk factors and neighborhood risk factors. And then, of course, one of these mediators is likely to be occupational opportunity. So the jobs that we work either expose us to risks or protect us, and some of them are both. And so what we do during our life really matters in terms of how we age, brain age. And just to get on the same page, what I mean by a disparity or a health inequity is something that is unnecessary and unavoidable, and avoidable, sorry, it is avoidable, and is rooted in a social injustice. So these aren't just differences, they're inequalities that can be addressed. So as I said, I'll give some evidence for disparities. I'll talk about some methodological challenges for people who have or who do research on disparities in Alzheimer's disease. And then I'll bring you to the really interesting stuff, I think, which is the potential mechanisms for them, and then what's needed to accelerate our research in this area. And so this is where I'm coming from. This is Washington Heights, the George Washington Bridge, right near the hospital, the Columbia University Medical Center. It's very urban, and if you've ever been there, you do not need to speak English at all to function fully. It's an ethnic enclave, primarily for Dominican Americans, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans. And so when I talk about Hispanics in my talk, or if I talk about Latinx people in my talk, it is primarily, I'm talking about Caribbean Hispanics. And I know that is not what you're talking about here in Texas. So I want to just orient you about who I'm talking about first, and also acknowledge that there's a ton of differences in the the home country that people are coming from, the reasons for immigration, the times of immigration, the kind of neighborhood that they live in is very unique. There's a lot of political, people are not high SES in this community, but politically in that neighborhood, there's a lot of power in the Dominican community. And so, I mean, they run the school district, they run, everything about that community is really very much, filtering through the Dominican community. So that's the context. It's very urban. And Richard Mayu has been running a study in that neighborhood since 1992. People who were eligible for Medicare, he arranged for CMS to give him the names and addresses of those people, and we matched them to telephone numbers, called them and asked them if they were willing to be in a longitudinal study of older adults. And that happened in 92, that happened in 1999, and again in 2009. So over 6,500 people have participated in this study. And from the beginning, all of the battery and all of the people who worked for the study in terms of the testers and the interviewers were fully bilingual, speaking Spanish and English, and all of the measures were more or less, with a couple of exceptions, validated for use in both Spanish and English speakers. In all of the recruitment time periods, we've looked at the census for that neighborhood, and they match. The census tracts that we sampled from matches the actual census in terms of people age 65 years and older, in terms of race, ethnicity, and education, sex, gender, and everything. So it's a really representative cohort. And we see them in their homes. So we don't ask that they come in to the hospital. We go out to their homes and see them every 18 to 24 months. As consistent with the age group, women outnumber men. There's many Spanish speakers in the study, monolingual. Most of the people who do the testing in Spanish classify themselves as monolingual Spanish speakers. So there's not a huge amount of bilingualism, although people, certainly not a lot of balanced bilingualism in this cohort. And we do an extensive neuropsych battery and medical and functional activities interview. And this is the neighborhood of northern Manhattan or Washington Heights here. The cohort is largely describing themselves as Hispanic. There are non-Hispanic blacks in the cohort. About 10% were born outside the US. And also about 30%, 25 to 30% of the cohort describes themselves as non-Hispanic and white. And they're also very diverse. Many of them, their first language is Polish or Hungarian. In the Inwood area, there's a large group of people who escaped World War II. And so there's a lot of diversity among the whites as well. And one of the biggest findings, which one of my students, Wei-Ming Watson, is refreshing now, is that the Hispanics and the non-Hispanic blacks in the cohort are at much higher risk for developing dementia over time, incident dementia, than are the non-Hispanic whites in the cohort. So you can see that up here, the Hispanics in the tan and the blacks in the green are at higher risk at all, essentially all age groups, for developing new cases, new incidents of dementia. This is true when you restrict it to Alzheimer's disease as well. We have very few cases of pure vascular dementia or Lewy body or anything like that. It's very different from a memory disorders clinic where you see a lot more diverse kinds of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia in this cohort. So, and our study that originally was published, this difference in incidence was published in 1992, has been replicated across the country. And this is a particularly great study by Elizabeth Rose Maeda, who used the Kaiser healthcare cohort in California to look at incidence in the Kaiser healthcare system, and found that the reference group, as opposed to being the whites, in her study was the Asian Americans. Now, from Kaiser, she's not able to tell whether they're Japanese or Chinese or whatever other kind of Asian American, but just that they self-identified as Asian American in the Kaiser study. And the group that was at highest risk of developing a new case of dementia using the electronic medical records was the African Americans and the American Indian and Alaskan Native groups, with Hispanics not too far behind. So again, a study showing that certain groups are at higher risk, and that this one being very unique is having enough Asian Americans in the cohort to show that they have the lowest rates. Maria Gleamore looked at the regional sort of aspect to these disparities and found that using the CDC records and based on death certificates, I don't know why I had a problem coming up with that, death certificates, that people who were born in the stroke belt, whether they're black on this side or white on this side, whose death certificate said Alzheimer's disease or any kind of dementia, people who were born in the stroke belt were at higher risk of having that on their death certificate. Okay, and this isn't where you died. This is where you were born. So a lot of people moved from the South and now lived a lot of their life in the North. So this risk, you take it with you. And there's something about the stroke belt that puts people at higher risk, not just for stroke, but for poor brain health, poor dementia status, and Alzheimer's disease later in life. And we know another aspect of brain health is stroke. This is from the Regard study, showing that the blacks in the study at pretty much all the age groups are at higher risk for incident stroke compared to the whites in this national study, except at the oldest age group where there's a flip, and now whites are at higher risk for stroke than blacks. So we're going to talk about that flip in a minute and what that means. And I think what I want to say about the studies that I showed is that each of them, because they are representative of a neighborhood or an entire healthcare system like Kaiser, where essentially if you're in Northern California and you had a job, you're going to have Kaiser, or Regards, where they did a random digit dialing sampling all over the country to get people. Most of the studies that are traditionally used for Alzheimer's disease and related disorders research are convenient samples, and they're subject to tremendous selection bias. And one of the ways that this affects disparities research primarily is that people who show up to clinics for memory disorders who are African American or Hispanic or are Spanish speakers are very, very different than the people who are living in the community. They're extremely special. They have gotten to this specialty clinic. They tend to be, when they have dementia, very, very late in the disease and have a lot of neuropsychiatric symptoms. So wandering, aggression, paranoia, that sort of thing. So that's sort of been found over and over again, that the ethnic minorities and low SES people who actually make their way to a geriatrician or to a neurologist or to a psychiatrist whose specialty is dementia are very different from the white families who come to the clinic. And so sampling from that kind of setting where most Alzheimer's disease research has comfortably sat for many, many years means that any conclusions that you make about race ethnicity, I think are wrong. I think are wrong. So let's see. Let's see who's wrong. No. Part of it is part of the reason for this difference in who comes to the memory disorders clinic is a lack of mistrust in the medical system. There's not anyone, I mean, Alzheimer's disease is a stigmatizing and disempowering experience for even the most resourced people. But for people who are coming from low socioeconomic status or for whom English isn't their first language, or who are racial minorities, they or their family have experienced discrimination in the medical system somewhere along the way. Calling the receptionist or the billing to make an appointment or resolve a bill for somebody who and the person doesn't speak Spanish. And so it's just impossible to kind of get stuff done and to get it done in the right way for your family in many medical settings. And of course, we have some historical medical abuses to explain, or to be accountable for. Lisa Barnes is a colleague at Rush Medical Center in Chicago, and she's doing wonderful work in the community where the Rush cohort has traditionally enrolled people who in their Alzheimer's disease, their longitudinal Alzheimer's disease research center, who are willing to do brain donation. So until we had a lot of the in vivo neuroimaging techniques that I'll show you a little bit in a minute, the only way to definitively determine whether someone had amyloid in their brain was to do a brain autopsy and get brain donation. As you can imagine, it really is a very special person and a special family that agrees to have their loved one have their brain donated after they die. They need to have a close relationship with the doctor. They need to, I think, believe that this is going to help science and this is going to potentially even help their family understand what was going on with their loved one while they were alive. And she's been trying to enroll African Americans where, before she got started, essentially, in the collective national database for Alzheimer's disease, there were no African Americans in that cohort. So in the years that she's been working, she had 41 African Americans that she was able to enroll in brain donation, and they had thousands of white people she matched 81 of them for this particular study and found that mixed pathology was more common in the African American brains than in the white brains of people, all of whom were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So given what I've been talking about with selection bias, is the conclusion of this study that mixed pathology is more common in African Americans than it is in whites? We don't really know. It seems like maybe the African Americans who showed up to the clinic and got diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, as I said, they're more likely to have neuropsychiatric symptoms, and in fact, they found more Lewy body neuropathology in their brain. There was more vascular neuropathology in their brain. So it's not 100% clear. It could be that among the Caucasians, there is a subset of people whose brains look exactly like the African Americans. It's just that they're going to have higher rates of neuropathology and so on and so forth. So we're not sure. Last year, John Morris at Washington University, St. Louis published this paper, and the headline and the conclusion was, there are race-dependent biological mechanisms that contribute to the expression of Alzheimer's disease. And he based that on about 100 blacks who are in the orange here, who volunteered to either do a spinal tap and a PET scan where they had their amyloid in their brain looked at on the PET scan, versus about 1,000 whites who'd been participating in the study for a very long time. And they found that there was no more amyloid in the brains of the blacks versus the whites, so they were equal on amyloid across age, but that the blacks had less tau when they looked at their CSF. Blacks had less tau than whites. And so they concluded that there are race-dependent biological mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease. Again, I don't think we know this at all. They also found that the African Americans in their imaging study didn't have more white matter hyperintensities, which goes against every single published study of African Americans who seem to have more white matter hyperintensities with every age category. So it's a weird sample. It's very, very strange. And so to conclude, make conclusions about racial differences or even sex differences in a population where women are more likely to come forward, or men only come forward because the women bring them. These are selection issues that we need to keep in mind. And one other bias is a survival bias. Laura Zahadny, when she was a postdoc with us, looked at the MIDAS study, which is a midlife longitudinal study, and the YCAP study, which I already told you about, and looked at racial differences in scores on memory tests, and found that when she split each sample in half in terms of age, so this is young midlife, these are people 57, younger than 57, and this is old midlife, so this is 57 and older. And all the graphs that I'm going to show throughout my life are always going to have me in the young group. I'm always going to be in the younger group. So I'll have to change it as time goes on. But anyway, the disparities in memory, the racial disparities in memory narrowed in the older group in MIDAS when she did this. And the disparities in memory in YCAP, even though the split was older, so YCAP is an older sample, the young old is less than 75 years and the old is 75 years and older. Again, that disparity in the young old narrowed later on, and these are cross-sectional data. So really what it's showing is that people, the ethnic minorities, the African Americans in this case, who live to an older age are healthier in general than the ethnic minorities or the African Americans in this case who are in the younger group. There's a survival bias that makes it look like the disparity is narrower than it actually is. So we need to adjust for death and being available for study in these cohorts. And that's exactly what explains this flip in the stroke data. So if you do a simulation and you model death, blacks are at higher risk for stroke at all ages. It's just that now, by the time you're 85, the ones who would have had stroke are dead. And so that's why you can sometimes find things that are completely opposite. I saw one study, it was actually pointed out to me by Maria Gleamore, where they looked at deaths, cardiovascular disease deaths, and looked at how it was narrowing and narrowing among blacks after age 65, and attributed that to the availability of Medicare. So thanks to Medicare, the disparities are narrowing bit by bit. But it was actually just that the people who were most vulnerable were dying and leaving the most hardiest, healthiest people in the cohort. So this is Carl Hill, and a while back he and his colleagues published this disparities research framework, which gives us a nice look at how some of these fundamental factors that might drive disparities in aging contribute across the life's course to health. He's looking at many different levels of analysis: environmental, sociocultural, behavioral, and biological. So there may be genetic or biological differences across populations, but they interact throughout the life course to environmental exposures, psychological coping mechanisms, and other factors. So we've been really using this framework and this model to study disparities in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And this is Adam Rickman, who found that in the YCAP cohort, this is just one evidence of what I was telling you before about white matter hyperintensities and why John Morris's study was so weird, is that African Americans and Hispanics across the age range are more likely to have these white matter hyperintensities, which are unusual spots in the white matter that you wouldn't normally see. A white matter should be the myelin around subcortical, in the subcortical areas of the brain, should be contiguous and shouldn't have little dots or holes in it. I'll show you white matter hyperintensities in a minute. And if you add all those up, if you have a computer program that will help you look at the total burden of white matter hyperintensities and the amount of white matter volume loss, it looks like it's more in African Americans and Hispanics in YCAP. But there's no interaction with age here, as you can see. It's completely parallel across the age. And we're not born with white matter hyperintensities. So somewhere along the way, African Americans and Hispanics had to have an acceleration. But we totally missed it because we started scanning people at age 70. And so this is what has motivated one of the grants that we're doing now, which is the Offspring Grant. We're recruiting the adult midlife children of the YCAP cohort. And we're doing imaging in them starting at age 30 and up to see if we can capture, what some of the risk factors are and when these critical periods are for development of cerebrovascular disease across race. So I should have put these before, but these are white matter hyperintensities. You see how they kind of hug the ventricles there? That's very common. And then there's some different kinds of white matter hyperintensities that are sort of away from the ventricles. And Adam is studying, whether the periventricular ones are more harmful than the ones that are sort of further out, and whether the ones in the front of the brain have a different contributor to brain health than the ones in the back of the brain. So he's doing regional and volume studies. And what he's found is that the volume of white matter hyperintensities in the brain overall, as you know, is higher in African Americans, but whites have them too. But it's not related to cognition in whites. The volume of white matter hyperintensities is negatively related to cognition in the African Americans in the YCAP cohort. He's also looking at hippocampal volume. So this is an MRI, a structural MRI of the brain, and he's looking at both the right and left hippocampus. And the hippocampal volume at baseline is related to future development of dementia, incident dementia, in whites in the YCAP cohort, but is unrelated to future development of dementia in the non-Hispanic blacks in the cohort. So we're pursuing these questions not only in the younger group, but also adding the Hispanic group to this and finding really interesting relationships between cognition, brain health, and race ethnicity. So while John Morris's conclusion, I think, was problematic for the data that he had, he may be right that there are different mechanisms through which people develop brain impairment and brain health, and there may also be different resilience mechanisms, and that's something we're really interested in finding out more about. Okay, so many of you may be raising your hand and saying, want to raise your hand and say, well, what are you talking about when you say black people? What do you mean when you're talking about white people? Like, there's a lot of different backgrounds, and you don't mean biology, right? Because there's, racial differences. There's a ton of admixture in all of us, and I did my 23andMe, and I'm this and that. Well, one of the researchers, I think he was when he did the study at Vanderbilt, Tim Holman, wanted to know whether why are African Americans at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease? Maybe there's something about African ancestry that puts us at higher risk for developing the disease. So maybe that there's something linked to the genetic code in African Americans that puts us at higher risk. And in fact, in this paper, he showed that that African Americans who had Alzheimer's disease compared to African Americans who did not had more African ancestry when you do that 23andMe type of analysis across the whole genome than did controls. And you can't see it all the way back, but this is 80% African ancestry, and this is 79% African ancestry. So it's not a big difference, really. But it's significant because there are thousands of people in each of these cells, okay? And we've been thinking about that a lot and what African ancestry really means in this country, having more African ancestry. What it means is that your skin is darker, your hair is curlier, your nose is broader, you may have other sort of outward features of African ancestry that may connote that you are a black person, and that welcomes what we know is happening throughout Lifecourse, which is racism and discrimination. And so we've been thinking a lot about how African ancestry may be a really good proxy for not just your own experiences of racism, but those of your parents and your grandparents and your whole line. So let me just say that in the Health and Retirement Survey, in fact, people who are black, non-Hispanic black, and have higher levels of African ancestry are less likely to have gotten an inheritance from their parents. Their parents' education is lower. Their own education is lower. Their income is lower. It's a really good proxy for all these socioeconomic and intergenerational socioeconomic disadvantages in the United States. And what one of our research assistants, after learning about this research, Juliette Colon, wanted to do was ask this question in our Hispanic, Caribbean Hispanic sample, which is a huge group of people with varying levels of African ancestry. So first, I'll just show you, this is a cognitive composite. Okay, so this is an overall Z-score for their cognitive function. And what she showed And these people were all, we first just made a cut, like if they were demented, we cut them out of this particular analysis. And so these are people at baseline, their cognition, and this is within the Hispanics, people who self-identified as white, people who self-identified as black, and as I was saying earlier today, the people who was about 80% of the people who were like, you know I'm Dominican, right? We don't do that. We don't do the white-black thing. I'm Dominican, and that's it. So they refused to choose. They refused to choose. So it is unusual for someone to choose white in our cohort of older adults. It is unusual, you can see by the error bars, for people to choose black. And it's very common for people to choose other race. But check it out, the people who self-identified as white had higher cognitive test scores than the people who self-identified as black or other. Then she looked at African ancestry, which is genetic, determined genetically, and just made quartiles. Here's the people who had low African ancestry, and they had the highest scores on our cognitive measure, higher than the people who had higher levels of African ancestry within the group. So I am not saying here that the more African ancestry you have, it makes you smarter or better at cognition or have a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, because when we looked at some of the social variables, we were able to explain these differences entirely. When we looked at educational attainment, quality of education, and childhood SES, these differences went away. So be very wary when you see studies of ancestry and health outcomes, because I think that they may be using that ancestry as a proxy for some of the social forces that I've been talking about. We are looking at discrimination in our cohort and finding that people who perceive more instances of discrimination throughout their lifetime tend to be around more white people. So these are all African Americans. The higher SES African Americans report more experiences of discrimination. And for the most part, those people who are higher SES obtain higher scores on cognitive tests. So that gives you the annoying result that people who are experiencing more discrimination are doing better on tests. But when we were looking, we saw that the relationship was a little bit different in men and women, and very different depending on their level of education. So in blue, these people got a high school degree, red, college degree, and green, beyond college. So you can see among the men, at the graduate level, the more discrimination they experienced, the lower their cognitive function was. That's going in the direction you would anticipate if there was some sort of stress mechanism through which discrimination worked on cognition. And that's also true among the women, that the direction seems to be negative among the graduate level women. So there is an interaction between education and sex and discrimination on cognitive function. We've also, another mechanism that we've been looking at is educational experience. Literacy is one of them. We found a while back that people who had no formal education, who were illiterate versus literate, we found some differences in their cognitive test scores. And then when we measured reading level, we found that people with low reading level, regardless of race, had a steeper memory decline than people with high reading level. And then Miguel Arce, and inspired by a summer medical student, Gloria Felix, looked at risk of developing dementia among people with very few years of school. So these are all people who had less than 4 years of school. Some of them learned how to read and write, and some of them did not. And the people who were literate in that group were at lower risk for developing dementia than the people who were illiterate in that group. So the idea here was to separate out educational attainment from literacy to try to understand if there was something about that reading and writing that gave people a special edge in terms of cognitive aging. Interestingly, when he looked at cognitive trajectory, and this is our memory composite, they were utterly equal. So what this might mean is that, at some point we've got a cutoff for dementia. This is not really how it works in YCAP, but imagine there's a cutoff for dementia. The illiterate people are closer to that cutoff than the literate people. And that's why you see this sort of equivalent trajectory over time, but different rates of developing new case of dementia. Some more evidence, for educational changes driving dementia risk is a number of studies that have shown that if you're born later, you're at lower risk for developing dementia. So these secular changes in risk. And Jamie Noble, a couple years ago, published this study showing in the 92 cohort, the cohort in YCAP that was recruited in 1992, versus the 1999 cohort. The 99 cohort was at much lower risk for dementia, regardless of race. So you can see the rate of incident dementia in whites in 92 was 8.2 and 5.7 in whites. Blacks went way down from about 20% to 10%, and Hispanics way down from 25% to 17%. So what Jamie showed was that what explained the difference or the reduction in risk across people in these different cohorts was education. That people that were African American who were born earlier weren't subject to compulsory school laws in the states where they lived, and were allowed to leave work or leave school earlier, and then those school laws came in place, and they were required to stay in school until they were 16 or whatever, and they were exposed to more years, and that explained this difference. And yet Val Ku is one of my postdocs, looked at trajectory, again finding that people who were born later had a shallower decline in memory over time compared to people who were born earlier. And when we then added in our potential mediators, we found that years of education explained this entirely. Okay. In the REGARD study, which I've been talking today to a bunch of people about, it was originally a study of stroke and oversampled the stroke belt to look at geographic and racial disparities in risk for stroke. And it's a huge study taking place mainly over the phone. They started doing memory testing and language testing over the phone about a year or 2 years into the study. So now we have every couple years a longitudinal look at people's cognition over time who are all non-Hispanic, white, and African American. And what Maria Gleamore and I have been doing for years is gathering up data on school policy changes, some of those compulsory school law changes that I was telling you about, but also each state since 1911 put out data on teacher-student ratios and attendance ratios and length of school year. So some school districts, some counties just weren't open as long. And segregated black schools were not in the same county, were not open for as many months as the segregated white schools in the South. So this is part of this whole picture of school quality across race and across region. And I'll show you length of school year. If you're an African American in South Carolina, was much, much shorter than the whites in South Carolina, who, it's also a shorter school year than the people who were born and raised in northern schools where they weren't closing the schools so that people could work in the fields or whatever. But still, this is one aspect of the disparities in quality of school. This is student-teacher ratio. This is elementary school. So in some of these states, if you're black, you're sharing your classroom with 40, 50 other children as you're growing up. That's just the norm. When you look at this on a national level, you see these huge disparities in school quality by race. Here, the darker states correspond to more quality predicted years of school. But it's also been changing over time. So later born people had, according to these numbers, higher school quality. Okay, so we're looking at something that changes a lot with respect to race and space and time. And what we've been finding is that if you attended these higher quality schools, your returns to the number of years of school cognitively, your cognitive returns to education are much greater. So regardless of race, if you attended school in a place where the term length was on average 180 days versus 150 days, you have better later life cognition than people who were in the shorter years of shorter school years. I should have said that in regards, how are we matching people to where they went to school and these historical data? One brilliant thing that they did in the beginning was ask people every place they ever lived. So we essentially took the place that they said they lived, we coded it in terms of the county when at age 6, which is the normal age of school entry, and then we were able to sort of get this quality of school data from that county based on these historical records. And it looks like the payoff to higher school quality is different across race and sex. So overall, people who, for every one more year of quality predicted years of school, you're 40% less likely to have cognitive impairment later in life. But you can see that this payoff is the least in the black men. So when you split this out, they are only about 14% less likely, having the same 1 year of higher predicted school quality, whereas for white women, they're about 30% less likely to have cognitive impairment. And this survives adjustment from state fixed effects and also childhood SES. That's what we have here in Model 4. But still, it looks like there's something about being a black man in this country that throughout your entire life sort of reduces any sort of childhood advantage you may have in terms of cognitive function. So I think we've also seen that in some of the economic research. Raj Chetty has shown that black boys who were born into wealth are much more likely to have a loss of that wealth throughout their life, and there's health impacts of that. The black girls are born into the same families, and they are also black. So there's really something about black men and the way that black men are treated in this country that reduces the advantage, the health advantages that we can have. I'm really excited about Project Talent. This is a study that took place in 1960. And they sampled 1,255 schools across the country. 70 of them were all black schools. And they included, when they sampled a school randomly, they included every student in the school. And in a 2-day assessment of cognitive function, a questionnaire about their family and about their neighborhood. And every principal or administrator in the school also filled out an extensive questionnaire about the school and about the community. And so they also asked about personality and as I said, family SES. So we got a grant to find these people 58 years later and do a cognitive assessment of them over the phone. And the huge advantage to this is that now we can look at childhood SES when it was measured in 1960, and also school quality, not how you reported it to me or these, administrative records that are dusty and you have to wear gloves to go look at it in Teachers College. I can actually read what the principal told me in that school. I've got all their peers, so I also know who survived to be in their 70s compared to the people who were originally sampled in 1960. So I can really adjust for that survival bias. And we've been looking at how school quality as a composite score of teacher qualifications, class size, and term length relates to cognitive decline, adjusting for childhood SES and their cognition in 1960. Because you can imagine that people who were well endowed cognitively as adolescents may be at lower risk for developing cognitive impairment when they're older. And what we found is that in general, the higher the school quality, the better their cognitive function. I'm showing you here just one of the tests, which is F fluency that we give over the phone, as many words that you can that begin with the letter F in a minute. But this is also true, this relationship is also true in our memory test, which is a wordless memory test that we do over the phone. So the higher the school quality of the school that you attended, in the high school that you attended, the better your score on the memory and fluency tests. But as one of my postdocs, Nika Seblova, found, that this relationship was not the case. In fact, it was opposite in the blacks in the study. So the higher quality schools seem to relate to lower cognitive test score in the blacks in Project Talent. So right now we're trying to figure out why that is. I actually thought that the payoff to school quality wouldn't be as high among the African Americans based on the other studies that I showed you, but I didn't know it would be like reversed. And so we did account for death and loss to follow-up here. We weighted everyone depending on for response rate, since we know who we didn't get. So we're looking into this further to figure out what happened here. But in YCAP, if you look at that original disparity in incident Alzheimer's disease, so this is just another way of looking at the hazard ratio for developing incident Alzheimer's disease across race is higher, even after you account for people who have stroke. The E4 allele doesn't do anything here, or having few years of school. You still find that African Americans are at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease than whites, until you adjust for this proxy reading level of school quality. You can't explain the racial differences. So in that last model, we found something that can explain why African Americans in our cohort are at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, and that is they attended lower quality schools. So I think some of the challenges for our research are that most of our studies use convenient samples. And I sort of told you that there are a lot of different ways of overcoming that. Some of it is using large epi-based cohorts, but then you have the problem of not having much time to assess cognition. You might need to do it over the phone, and you can't do your careful 8-hour cognitive batteries that neuropsychologists love to do. But we need to shorten it up and make it relevant. It's when you collaborate with people who are doing the careful cognitive assessment, they really don't want to measure social determinants of health. Like, they think that takes too much time. So we need to actually measure it. So the John Morrises of the world, right? He couldn't explain why his Tau measures were lower in African Americans because he didn't have any data on income. He had no data on childhood SES. He hadn't collected it. So we need to merge these two fields and think together about what we should be measuring. And then we need harmonized measures to combine our samples and make them bigger, and to be able to compare across cultural and ethnic groups. So these designs need to bridge not just the biology of the disease, but also the exposure across the life course. We need to measure systemic racism. I can't tell you how many studies I've talked to that don't want to put a measure of racism or discrimination in their study because the PIs are really like, I don't really want to ask that. That's going to scare people. And so we need to talk about all the different creative ways to measure, how people are thinking about their experiences of discrimination throughout their life and how it's affected them. We need feasible biomarkers. I showed you some PET data, which is PET scans of the brain where you have to be injected with a radio tracer. And then we had somebody who was in the offspring study go to Port Authority right after their PET scan, and they set off the radiation alarm. So, I mean, it's a very burdensome procedure. What's great is that these blood tests for amyloid and tau and neurofilament light are being more widely used as biomarkers, blood-based biomarkers for neurodegeneration. And then I think just to underline that highly selected samples, it doesn't matter how big they are. So the UK Biobank is not a useful, it's got, hundreds of thousands of people in it, but it's not useful for disparities research because it's not representative. And then we need to, as ADRD researchers, make sure that we're providing clarity for people about the limits of what you can say with convenient samples versus target or population-based samples. And then overall, if we're going to have a national plan for reducing Alzheimer's disease in this country, which we have now a national plan, it has to include social factors in that reduction. So it's not just about a race to get the drugs to reduce the amyloid in the brain, which does not seem to be working so far. It's also about addressing throughout the life course the kind of inequalities that lead to a later life that is more vulnerable to some of the neuropathologies that we have. We want to live long, healthy lives with our cognition intact. And so racism and discrimination are bad for everyone, not just ethnic minorities. If we increase educational quality and decrease school segregation, that those are good things to do for everyone. And I think improving early life education and addressing neighborhood inequalities is the moral right thing to do, of course, and also looks like it may improve brain health. So thank you for paying attention.
UTMB Health, working together to work wonders.